The crystal clinked, a sound that usually signaled celebration. But for 16-year-old Kiana, standing at the edge of the opulent ballroom, it felt like a starting pistol for a race she never wanted to run. It was her stepmother, Eleanor's 50th birthday party, a sea of pearls, designer dresses, and condescending smiles. And Kiana, in her simple, deep blue dress, felt like a shadow against the gilded wallpaper. They laughed at her, not always with their voices, but with their eyes. A glance at her braided hair, a whispered comment about her interesting dress, a patronizing question about her urban music taste. They laughed because she was the quiet black stepdaughter from the wrong side of the family, an awkward addition to their perfect, polished world. But tonight, the laughter was about to stop, because Kiana held a secret in her hands and a truth in her heart that would leave every single one of them in a silence so profound. They would never forget the girl they'd underestimated. Music shifts to a tense, subtle underscore. Kiana's life had been a study in contrasts for the past 3 years. Her mother's passing had thrust her from their small, vibrant, art-filled apartment into her father's cold, sprawling mansion. Her father, David, a kind but emotionally absent man, had found solace and a new life with Eleanor, a woman whose elegance was as sharp as her tongue. Eleanor's world was one of country clubs, charity galas, and social climbing. Her 2 biological daughters, Ashley and Brittany, carbon copies of their mother, had perfected the art of subtle cruelty. They'd mock Kiana's love for poetry, calling it depressing, and dismiss her academic achievements as cute. They laughed when she misused a piece of silverware at a formal dinner, their giggles like needles pricking her skin. Her father, desperate for peace, would simply say, "Just try to fit in, sweetheart. They don't mean any harm." But the harm was a constant low hum in the background of her life, a reminder that she would always be an outsider. The birthday party was the pinnacle of Eleanor's social calendar. For weeks, the house had been a whirlwind of planners and florists. Kiana had been largely ignored, a ghost in her own home. The one task she was given was a mockery in itself. Eleanor, with a saccharine smile, had handed her a stack of fancy cardstock. "You have such nice handwriting, Kiana," she'd said. "You can write out the place cards." A simple, menial job for a simple girl, her eyes seemed to add. Ashley and Brittany had snickered, already dressed in their extravagant gowns for the evening. But as Kiana sat alone at the large mahogany desk, carefully inscribing the names of judges, CEOs, and socialites, she noticed something. Tucked away in a drawer, forgotten, was a stack of old photographs. They were of her father and her mother, from a time before money and mansions. There they were, laughing on a beach, her mother's afro blowing in the wind, her father looking younger, freer. And tucked behind one photo was a folded piece of paper, a poem her mother had written for David, a love letter filled with promises of building a future together, a future that never included Eleanor. That poem became her anchor. It was the secret in her hands. She had folded it carefully and placed it in the small clutch purse she carried tonight. It was her mother's voice, a ghost in the room ready to speak. The party unfolded around her like a play she wasn't in. She heard the snippets of conversation, the laughter that seemed to die whenever she walked by. "David's other daughter," she heard a woman whisper. "Such a shame, she doesn't really take after him, does she?" Another replied. Ashley and Brittany held court, surrounded by their friends, casting smug glances in Kiana's direction. This was their world, and they were making sure she knew it. Then came the moment for the speeches. Eleanor stood, beaming, as her husband, David, gave a glowing tribute to her beauty and grace. Ashley and Brittany followed with rehearsed, syrupy speeches about the world's best mom. The applause was thunderous. Then, to Kiana's utter shock, her father looked at her. "And now, I'd like to call up my daughter, Kiana, to say a few words." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. A hush fell over the room. It wasn't a respectful hush. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated curiosity and condescension. They were waiting for the awkward girl to stumble. Eleanor's smile was tight, her eyes warning Kiana not to ruin her perfect evening. Ashley and Brittany exchanged smirks, ready for the show. This was the moment the laughter was supposed to peak. As Kiana walked to the microphone, her knees trembling, she heard a distinct muffled giggle from her stepsister's table. It was the spark that lit the fuse. She reached the podium, the lights bright in her eyes. She looked out at the sea of expectant, mocking faces. For a second she froze. Then, her fingers brushed against the folded paper in her clutch. She didn't take it out. She didn't need to. She had memorized every word. She leaned into the microphone, her voice initially quiet but clear. 3 years ago, she began, my world ended. I lost my mother, and I was brought into a new world. A world of beautiful things. She gestured vaguely at the opulent room. A few people nodded, thinking this was a compliment. I was told to be grateful, to fit in, to be quiet. Her voice grew stronger, losing its tremor. I was given small jobs like writing place cards, while others planned parties. I was laughed at for my clothes, for my music, for the way I grieve. The room was growing uncomfortably quiet. The smirks had vanished from Ashley and Brittany's faces. Eleanor's smile was gone, replaced by a stony mask. But what I've learned, Kiana continued, her eyes now locking with her father's, is that the loudest laughter often hides the deepest insecurities, and the quietest people often hold the deepest truths. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. My mother was a poet. She didn't have pearls or a mansion, but she had a love so strong she wrote about building a future with the man she loved. A future built on promises, not pretense. She then recited a line from the poem, her voice filled with a passion that captivated the room. Our home will not be made of stone, but of stories. Our wealth will not be in gold, but in grace. She looked directly at Eleanor. You can have your stone mansion. You can have your gold, but you will never have the grace of the woman who came before you. And you will never, ever silence her story or her daughter. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, profound silence, thick with shame and awe. You could have heard a pin drop. The condescending smiles had been wiped away, replaced by looks of stunned respect, and for some, deep embarrassment. Her father had tears streaming down his face, finally seeing the pain he had allowed to fester. Kiana didn't wait for applause. She simply said, "Happy birthday, Eleanor," and walked away from the microphone, leaving a room full of people utterly, completely, and forever silent. The laughter had died, replaced by the echoing power of a truth they never saw coming. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had found her voice, and it was her mother's voice, and together they were finally heard. They were finally heard. There is a silence that is empty, and there is a silence that is full. The void Kiana left behind was deafeningly, powerfully full. It was filled with the echoes of her mother's poetry, the sharp truth of her words, and the collective shame of a room that had misjudged her. For a long moment no one moved. No one clapped. The spectacle was over, but the real drama was just beginning. The stepdaughter they had laughed at had just rewritten the script, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The first sound to break the stillness was a single, slow clap. It came from an elderly woman near the back, a friend of Eleanor's family, whose eyes were glistening with tears. Then another person joined in, and then another. The applause wasn't the roaring, celebratory kind that had followed the other speeches. It was slower, more thoughtful, almost reverent. It was applause for courage, not for performance. Kiana didn't hear it. She was already halfway up the grand staircase, the sound muffled by the pounding of her own heart. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt hollowed out, as if she had poured her entire soul into the microphone and left her body behind. Downstairs, the party shattered into 100 hushed, frantic conversations. The perfect facade of Eleanor's birthday was irreparably cracked. Guests gathered in small clusters, whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting towards a mortified Eleanor, whose face was a mask of controlled fury, and towards David, who looked as if he'd been physically struck. Ashley and Brittany had disappeared, utterly humiliated. The social event of the season had become a scandal, and Kiana was at the center of it. But for the first time, she wasn't the victim of the scandal. She was its architect. David found her 20 minutes later. She was sitting on the floor of her bedroom, still in her blue dress, her back against the door. She heard his hesitant knock, then his voice, thick with emotion. "Kiana, please, baby. Let me in." She didn't answer, but after a moment she unlocked the door. He stepped inside, and the sight of him broke her resolve. The great David Harrington, powerful businessman, looked old and broken. Tears welled in his eyes as he sank to the floor beside her. not on the expensive chaise lounge, but on the carpet, meeting her at her level. "I am so sorry," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I have been so blind, so stupid. I thought if I just gave you this life, this house, everything would be okay. I thought I was protecting you by asking you to be quiet." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "I failed you. I failed your mother. I heard her in your words tonight. I heard her strength, and I have been trying to bury her memory in this museum of a house." He looked around her room, which, unlike the rest of the mansion, was filled with her mother's paintings and her own sketches. It was the only room that felt alive. That night, a bridge was built between them, not of words, but of shared grief and a long overdue understanding. The wall of silence and compliance had been demolished. The days that followed were tense, but different. Eleanor moved through the house like an ice queen, speaking to Kiana only when necessary, her words clipped and cold. But the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The cruel comments from Ashley and Brittany ceased entirely. They now avoided her, their confidence shattered. They were no longer the untouchable princesses of the manor. They were the girls who had been publicly shamed for their pettiness. Kiana found a strange, quiet power in their avoidance. She began to reclaim her space. She started playing her mother's old jazz records in the living room, the soulful melodies a stark contrast to the classical music Eleanor preferred. She didn't ask for permission. She simply did it. Her father, instead of shushing her, would sometimes sit and listen, a sad, distant smile on his face. He started joining her for breakfast, asking about her schoolwork, her poetry. It was awkward and new, but it was real. A pivotal moment came a week later. A large, flat package arrived for Kiana. Inside was one of her mother's most beautiful paintings, which had been in storage, a vibrant, abstract piece full of color and life. Without a word to anyone, Kiana took a hammer and a nail and hung it on the large, empty wall in the main foyer, right across from a bland, expensive landscape Eleanor had chosen. It was a declaration of war, but a peaceful one. When Eleanor saw it, she stopped dead in her tracks. She stared at the painting, then at Kiana, who stood defiantly nearby. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. And then something unexpected happened. Eleanor didn't order her to take it down. She simply gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and walked away. It was a surrender, not of affection, but of territory. Kiana had won the right to exist in that house, fully and authentically. The change wasn't just internal. At school, word of the speech had spread, transformed into a legend of epic revenge. But Kiana carried herself differently now. The girl who used to try to disappear into the walls now walked with her head held high. She joined the debate team, her voice, seasoned by her painful experience, becoming a powerful, persuasive instrument. She started a poetry club, creating a space for other quiet kids to find their voices. She had learned that her greatest strength wasn't in blending in, but in standing out. She had been forged in the fire of their mockery, and she had emerged stronger, not bitter. The story ends not with a dramatic reconciliation, but with a quiet scene of peace. It is 6 months later. Kiana is sitting in the garden, writing in a journal. Her father comes out and sits beside her. They talk about college applications. He suggests her mother's alma mater, a small liberal arts college known for its arts program. It is a full-circle moment, an acknowledgement and embrace of the legacy he had once tried to ignore. They laughed at the black stepdaughter until her speech left them silent. But her victory wasn't in their silence. It was in the sound of her own voice, finally free. It was in the healing of the relationship with her father. It was in the quiet courage to hang a painting on a wall and claim her space. She learned that the most powerful response to ridicule is not to retaliate with more noise, but to answer with a truth so clear, so dignified, that it commands respect. The laughter had tried to define her, but her silence after the speech, a silence of strength, not submission, was what truly defined her. She was no longer the black stepdaughter. She was Kiana, and her story was just beginning. Kiana, and her story was just beginning.